Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Rao's IAS Study Circle.
Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper, and the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion. Before starting today's discussion, I have an important announcement for you that we are releasing the DNS MCQs, or the MCQs that were based on various DNS from October 2020 till September 2021 for these three subjects presently, that is Indian economy, history and Indian polity and governance. The MCQs for other subjects like international relations, environment and ecology will be released in subsequent days. And these MCQs can be helpful for the revision of the various current affairs that were there in the news in the last year, and also will help you in the upcoming prelims examination. So do go to the links that have been provided in the description box below and also in the comment that has been pinned to this video. This article on page number 7 talks about tackling hate speech in India, and this has been published in the context of the use of term narcotic jihad by the Malabar Church bishop. In this regard, we need to analyze the different aspects of hate speech in India, how it is being punished, what are the provisions in the Indian laws, and has it been defined or not. In this regard, the Law Commission of India has provided various recommendations. So we'll look at these different aspects from the General Studies Paper 2 point of view in the topic Governance, Constitution and Polity. And that is why this becomes a very important topic for us from the mains examination perspective, because hate speech has continuously been in news, and it is seen as the misuse of the fundamental right that has been provided in the Article 19(2) related to freedom of speech and expression. So in this regard, let us first try and understand what has been the conception of the right of freedom of speech and expression. Then we will look at what are the various legal provisions that tackle hate speech in India. In this regard, what can be the impact of hate speech on the freedom of expression? Also, what have been the various recommendations of the international bodies regarding the hate speech? And after that, we'll look at some of the parameters can be used to define the hate speech, the manner in which the regulation of such hate speech should take place, and also the recommendations, both legal as well as non-legal measures provided by the Law Commission of India. Let us look at all these aspects one by one. Now, in a polity, it has been said that rights are the cornerstone of individual autonomy. They are guarantees as limits on the power of the state. We all know that the state is all powerful. However, these rights act as limits on the power of the state. In democratic societies, they have been granted to protect individual from undue state interference. Freedom of speech and expression has been enshrined in the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It is considered to be one of the most significant rights, as it allows a person to attain self-fulfillment and strengthen the capacity to fully enjoy freedom. And that is the whole conception of the rights, that is, it is the cornerstone of individual autonomy. They are guarantees as limits on the power of the state. In democratic societies, they protect individual from undue state interference. They have been recognized internationally under the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and also they are considered most important because these rights allow a person to attain self-fulfillment, and it strengthens their capacity to fully enjoy freedom. In this regard, in the Indian Constitution, we have two important articles related to freedom of speech and expression, and some restrictions have also been placed on such articles. So in this regard, in the Article 19(2), it places reasonable restrictions on the exercise of right of freedom of speech and expression in the interest of four factors. First, security of the state, sovereignty and integrity of India. Second, friendly relations with foreign states. Third, public order, and also decency or morality, or in relation to the contempt of court, defamation or incitement to an offence. In this regard, the Article 21, which relates to the life and liberty, highlights that liberty is not to be exercised to the detriment of any individual or to the disadvantaged sections of the society, which clearly highlights that liberty is not unlimited freedom and it has certain amount of restraints. So clearly, as we see the conception of rights, the freedom of speech and expression, and what are the reasonable restrictions provided in the Indian Constitution, let us next look at what are the legal provisions related to hate speech in India. So when it comes to hate speech, the term hate speech has not been clearly defined in any law in India, and that is the biggest issue that we face in tackling the menace of hate speech. However, there are various legal provisions which provide for or prohibit selected forms of speech as an exception to the freedom of speech. And such exceptions that have been provided to the freedom of speech are sometimes considered as being hate speech. However, it has been found difficult to clearly identify what all amounts to such exceptions to the freedom of speech. So in this background, let us look at how Indian Penal Code considers what is an exception to the freedom of speech. Firstly, the section 124A of the Indian Penal Code penalizes sedition. Secondly, the section 153A penalizes promotion of enmity between different groups on the ground of religion, race, place of birth, residence, language, etc. Thirdly, the 153B penalizes imputations, assertions prejudicial to the national integration. Article 295A penalizes deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage religious feelings of any class by insulting its religion or religious beliefs. The section 298A of the IPC penalizes uttering words with deliberate intent to wound the religious feelings of any person. And the section 501 and 2 of the IPC penalize publications or circulation of any statement, rumor, or report causing public mischief, enmity, hatred, or ill will between classes. But in reality or on ground, it becomes difficult to clearly identify what kind of speech will promote enmity between different groups or what kind of speech has been given deliberately with malicious intention. It is because the intention behind such speech cannot be clearly identified based on the laws that are existing in India to tackle the hate speech. Now, besides the IPC, there are other acts that deal with the issue of hate speech. In this regard, one of the platforms where the hate speech is being used continuously in India are the elections in India. And accordingly, the Representation of People Act 1951 in its section 8 disqualifies a person from contesting election if he is convicted for indulging in acts amounting to illegitimate use of freedom of speech and expression. The section 123 and the section 125 of the Representation of the People Act prohibits promotion of enmity on grounds of religion, race, caste, community or language in connection with the election as a corrupt electoral practice and prohibits it. Now, besides IPC and the Representation of the People Act, the Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955 tries to counter any hate speech which tries to promote untouchability, which has been a very menacing exercise or a practice that has existed in the Indian caste system. Then the Religious Institutions Act 1988 also provides for such provisions. In this regard, the district magistrates have also been provided with certain powers to tackle the issue of hate speech. The section 107 and the section 144 provides that the executive magistrate can prevent a person from committing a breach of peace or disturb the public tranquility or do any wrongful act that may probably cause breach of peace and disturb the public tranquility. It also empowers the district magistrate, the SDM, or any other executive magistrate specially empowered by the state government in this behalf to issue order in urgent cases of nuisance or apprehended danger. So certain amount of discretion has also been provided to the district magistrates, and that at times is misused and at times is used to curb the freedom of speech and expression or the rights that has been provided in the Indian Constitution. Then the question arises as to what is the impact of hate speech on freedom of speech and expression. Now, in this regard, it has been outlined that the hate speech is an expression which is likely to cause distress or offend other individuals on the basis of their association with a particular group or incite hostility towards them. For example, if any speech amounts to causing distress or it aims at offending a particular caste or particular religion, then such kind of an expression or speech can be considered as hate speech. Further, hate speech undermines the implicit assurance that has been provided to the citizens of a democracy. In this regard, this assurance has particularly been provided to minorities and the vulnerable sections of our society. And at times, the hate speech is used against minorities, the vulnerable groups, including the caste groups, or also the gender. Further, the technological revolution, and especially the internet and the accessibility of internet, allows offensive speech to affect a larger audience in a short span of time. And accordingly, tackling hate speech becomes exclusively important for the state in this regard. In this regard, the Human Rights Council's report has outlined that freedom of speech can be restricted on following grounds. First includes the child pornography to protect the right of the children. It can be restricted on the ground of hate speech to protect the rights of the affected communities. Defamation to protect the rights and reputation of others against unwarranted attacks. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide
to protect the rights of the others, advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And this has been provided in order to protect the rights of the others, such as the right to life, etc. Thus, even the Human Rights Councils recognize that there is need for restricting the freedom of expression in certain cases, and these are the cases that have been identified by the Human Rights Council. In this regard, what are the parameters that can be used to define hate speech have been outlined by the Law Commission in its report. First is, it should include the extremity of the hate speech, that is, the speech must be offensive and should project the extreme form of emotion. Second, if such hate speech is leading to incitement, it can be defined as hate speech. Thirdly, it also should take into account the status of the author of the speech, because people who hold power to influence society on a large scale can have damaging impact on the harmony in the society. In this regard, one of the example of the status of the author of the speech can be the hate speech given by the political authorities, and these politicians have high amount of power to influence society on a large scale. So in case any political speech is leading to or promoting enmity between two caste groups or between two religions, can be considered as or can be used in defining the hate speech. Fourth important aspect of defining the hate speech is the status of the victims of the speech. If any particular speech by a politician targets a particular community or the religion, then that particular community or religion, if that is vulnerable, that will also define or be a part of the hate speech. So a politician, for example, knowingly lays himself open to close scrutiny of his every word and deed by both journalists and the public at large. And accordingly, he must consequently display a greater degree of tolerance, because politicians are always in the public scrutiny, and that is why any speech against politician might not be considered as hate speech. On the other hand, if a speech by the politicians and if it targets any particular person or any particular caste or religion, then that kind of speech should be considered based on the status of the victims of the speech. And also, in what context was the speech given should also form a part of the definition of hate speech. So every seemingly hate speech may not be termed as hate speech, because the context in which the speech was made is essential in determining its permissibility. So these are some of the parameters or factors that can be taken into account for defining the hate speech. However, even after providing these parameters, the Law Commission has restrained itself from defining the hate speech clearly. Then the Law Commission talks about the manner of regulation of the hate speech. In this regard, the Law Commission has recommended that any attempt to regulate hate speech need not shrink the space for criticism and dissent, because the Constitution itself provides for freedom of speech and expression, and if we are here to regulate the hate speech, it should not curb the right that has been provided constitutionally to the citizens of India. And as a consequence, not all hate speech can legitimately be made the subject of legal prohibition. Secondly, the right is curtailed by the means of law passed through appropriate procedures and through provisions worded in explicit and unambiguous language. So for the laws that are regulating the hate speech, they should be passed through appropriate procedures, through provisions that are worded in explicit and unambiguous language. Also, such laws which regulate the hate speech must measure or must directly satisfy a legitimate aim. And last but not the least, such laws must be necessary to achieve its stated aim and must be proportionate to the harm that it attempts to prevent or redress. In this regard, some of the recommendations provided by the Law Commission include: incitement to violence cannot be the sole test for determining whether a speech amounts to hate speech or not. Even speech that does not incite violence has the potential of marginalizing a certain section of the society or individual. That is why the hate speech should not be limited to incitement to violence. Secondly, the term hate speech has been used invariably to mean expression which is abusive, insulting, intimidating, harassing, or which incites violence, hatred, or discrimination against groups which are identified by characteristics such as one's race, religion, place of birth, residence, region, language, caste or community, sexual orientation, or personal convictions. Then political speeches should take place in an environment that does not foster abusive or hateful sentiments. In this regard, it recommends that the Model Code of Conduct should be amended to expressly provide a provision that prohibits any kind of speech that promotes or attempts to promote feelings of enmity, hatred between different classes of citizens of India on the grounds of religion, race, caste, community, or language. and care must also be taken to differentiate hate speech from sedition. This is because sedition directly targets the state and also the integrity of the state. However, hate speech can be different from this particular aspect. Accordingly, care must be taken or special care must be taken to differentiate between what would amount to hate speech from that of sedition. Further, the Law Commission also provides for certain non-legal measures that can be adopted for tackling the hate speech in India. In this regard, it recommends popular television dramas which subtly and effectively promote harmony between warring communities. Secondly, the involvement of religious heads should be taken to build empathy across religion lines to decrease or reduce communal tension. Also, strategic intervention should also take place, especially in the context of social media, to monitor the dissemination of hate speech and mob mobilization. Also, persuading people should be done who are the weakest links to stop spreading or harmful rumor. And lastly, the Law Commission has recommended certain amendments to the Indian Penal Code and certain sections of the IPC. So the Law Commission has recommended that whoever on the ground of religion, race, caste, community, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, place of birth, residence, language, disability or tribe uses gravely threatening words, either spoken, written, signs, visible representations, within the hearing or sight of the person with the intention to cause fear or alarm, or advocates hatred by the words, either spoken or written, that causes incitements to violence, shall be punishable with imprisonment for either description for a term which may extend to 2 years and fine up to 5,000 or with both. Also, whoever publicly or intentionally on the grounds of religion, race, caste, etc. displays any writing, signs or other visible representations which is gravely threatening or derogatory within the hearing or sight of a person causing fear of alarm or with the intent to provoke use of unlawful violence against that person or another shall be punished with imprisonment for a term which may extend up to 1 year or fine up to rupees 5,000 or both. So these are the various aspects of hate speech that have been outlined in the Law Commission of India's report. What are the parameters that can be used to define hate speech, and also what exactly is the impact of hate speech. And finally, it has recommended certain legal measures as well as non-legal measures to tackle the menace of hate speech. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This editorial on page number 6 is related to the creation of Bad Bank by the Indian government to tackle the problem of non-performing assets in the Indian banking sector. Now, this topic is extremely important for us from the mains examination perspective in the coming mains examination of 2021. And it has been covered extensively in the last DNS video, and that is why I'll be attaching the video from that particular part for you to revise this particular important aspect from the mains examination perspective. Now, initially, a bad bank was proposed by the Economic Survey of 2016 and 17. However, the shape and the form that this bad bank has taken in its current form is different from what was proposed in the Economic Survey of 2016 and 17. In this regard, this becomes important for us to understand what is a bad bank, how it aims at solving the problem of non-performing assets, and also why was a bad bank required in the first place and what would be its utility. And in the end, we will try and understand what are the pros and cons of the establishment of such bad bank. Now, this is a very important issue as far as the General Studies paper 3 is concerned in the economic development. And some of the points that we discuss here will also be important for us from the preliminary examination perspective. Let us look at all these aspects one by one. Now, as the government has cleared the setting up of this bad bank, it was proposed in the Union Budget of 2021 and 22. And in the form of the bad bank, it was proposed to form an asset reconstruction company and an asset management company to solve one of the biggest problems that Indian economy faces, that is the twin balance sheet problem of the Indian banks. And all this was aimed at kickstarting or improving the credit creation in the Indian economy. In this line, the government has announced the formation of National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited, that is NARCL, and the India Debt Resolution Company Limited, IDRCL, to deal with this NPA problem. First one is the Asset Reconstruction Company, while the second one, that is the IDRCL, is the Asset Management Company. So let us start with the background first, that is when was the idea of bad bank proposed for the first time. So the Economic Survey of 2016 and 17 had proposed to set up a bad bank, and it was to be termed, according to the Economic Survey, as the Public Asset Rehabilitation Agency, or PARA. Now, the proposed scheme under the economic survey was that the PARA should be funded and owned by the government of India. And such a proposal was also put forward by the Indian Banks Association or the IBA recently in June 2020. But what is the difference between the bad bank that was proposed by the economic survey and the newly created National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited or the NARCL that has been passed by the central government? Let us look at this aspect. So the bad bank that was initially proposed by the economic survey was to be set up and owned by the government. However, this is not the case in the case of the bad bank that has been created. So the NARCL, which is the proposed bad bank, has been set up by the banks themselves. This is the first clear difference between the idea of bad bank that was proposed by the economic survey of 2016 and 17 and the one that has been created by the government presently. So clearly, the major difference lies in the nature of the ownership of this bad bank, which is termed as the NARCL or the National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited. But it is said that the nature of the role performed by the proposed bad bank under the economic survey and also the recently cleared or the created bad bank is the same, and that is why the terms bad bank and the asset reconstruction companies are used interchangeably. So the asset reconstruction companies presently are registered with the RBI and they are under the provisions of Sarfazi Act. Presently created NARCL has been incorporated under the Companies Act and it has applied to the Reserve Bank of India for license as an asset reconstruction company. And apart from the NARCL, that is the asset reconstruction company, an asset management company has been also created that has been termed as the India Debt Resolution Company Limited or the IDRCL. So what are the key features? Here the NARCL will be owned by the banks themselves and not by the government. This is the first important point that we need to understand. Secondly, the ARCs are registered with RBI. Also in this case, the NARCL will also be registered with the Reserve Bank of India. And besides the NARCL, which is the Asset Reconstruction Company, an asset management company has also been created by the name India Debt Resolution Company Limited or the IDRCL. This brings us to one important issue as to what is the difference between the asset reconstruction companies and the asset management companies. Let us first try and understand. So in this regard, the NARCL, which is the asset reconstruction company, buys the bad loans from the banks and then it transfers them to the asset management companies. And this asset management company, that is the IDRCL, would then carry out the restructuring to recover the bad loans. In this line, the asset management company or the IDRCL that has been created would be manned by professionals who have the necessary expertise in recovering the bad loans. And in case of India, as we note, the IDRCL or the India Debt Resolution Company has been set up as an asset management company which will manage the asset and engage market professionals and turnaround experts to deal with the problem of the non-performing assets. So clearly, the NARCL has been created as an ARC, that is Asset Reconstruction Company. This will buy the bad loans and then it will be transferred to Asset Management Company in the form of IDRCL. And this asset management company would then carry out the restructuring of the loans to recover these bad loans. So this is the bit of difference between the ARCs and the AMCs, and this is also the difference between the NARCL and the IDRCL that have been created as bad banks. Now, as stated earlier, the bad bank has been created to solve the twin balance sheet problem that the Indian economy faces. But let us first understand what is this twin balance sheet problem and what is its likely impact. Now, we all know that in an economy, the bank lends money to the businesses. Now, as the banks lend money to the businesses and if such businesses fail, it becomes difficult for the banks to recover the loans that they had provided initially. And due to this, the balance sheet of both the banks as well as the businesses are not in a good shape and they are both adversely affected. And this is mainly because the balance sheet of the banks is dominated by non-performing assets. And on the other hand, the balance sheet of the companies is dominated by higher debt levels and their inability to repay back the loans. And that is why this situation has been termed as a vicious cycle in the economy. And this situation becomes problematic for the economy because of the rising NPAs, the banks are not able to provide credit to the businesses. And the businesses which are already suffering from the inability to repay their loans are not able to attract more investments. And that is why this is a kind of vicious trap. So let us look at this situation in the form of a flow chart which highlights the vicious economic cycle that is created due to this twin balance sheet problem both in the banks as well as Indian businesses. So because of the failed businesses or various economic issues, there is increase in the non-performing assets of the bank. Due to this, what happens is that there is decrease in credit creation. Because of decrease in credit creation, there is decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which ultimately results into slowdown in the economy, and that leads to inability of the companies to repay back their loans. So this is a vicious trap because of the twin balance sheet problem, because of the rising NPAs in the banks, and also inability of the businesses to repay their loans back to the banks. So in order to solve the problem of the rising NPAs or the non-performing assets in the banks, the central government has paused or cleared the way for the formation of a bad bank. So in this regard, let us look at what is this bad bank and how it will perform the function of reducing the non-performing assets in the Indian economy. Let us look at this particular aspect. So what these bad banks will do is that they will take over the non-performing assets of the other banks and hence will lead to the improvement in their financial position. So for example, if for a bank, the non-performing assets amount to about rupees 1000 crores. Now because of the increasing non-performing assets or the high amount of non-performing assets, the RBI norms require that the bank should set aside certain percentage of its profits to cover these losses that are arising because of such non-performing assets. And these are termed as provisioning norm requirement due to the RBI guidelines. So the higher non-performing assets were leading to setting aside the higher amounts from the profits as a part of the provisioning norm requirement under the RBI guidelines. And this increase in the non-performing assets along with higher provisioning norm requirement were severely constraining the ability of the banks to lend further in the Indian economy. And overall, this was impacting their financial position and also the credit creation in the Indian economy, as we have seen in the flow chart in the previous slide. So in case of a bad bank, what it will do is that it will take over these non-performing assets at a fixed price. So let's say if the non-performing assets of the bank amount to about 1000 crores. So in this scenario, let's say the NPAs take over these non-performing assets at a price of rupees 800 crores. And once these NPAs are taken over by the bad bank, it will undertake a restructuring of such loans and also undertake any other mechanism to recover these non-performing asset amount. And how the banks will benefit? They will benefit by the way of the amount that is provided by the bad bank in the form of direct cash or in the form of the securities. And as the non-performing assets are taken over by the bad bank, it will improve the balance sheet of the banks because these non-performing assets will no more be in their balance sheets. And also the requirement of setting aside higher amounts from their profits under the provisioning norms will also be reduced considerably. So that is the main benefit of the creation of bad bank. First is that it will take over the non-performing assets from the balance sheet of the banks and hence will lead to their increased credit providing or lending capacity. And second is that the amount of profit that the banks need to set aside under the provisioning norms will also be reduced because their non-performing assets will now be removed from their balance sheets. So these are the two benefits of the bad banks. Now, how will the bad loans be resolved by the creation of such bad bank or the asset reconstruction company? Let us try and understand this. Now, we already know that there are high non-performing assets on the part of banks or in their balance sheet. And this is leading to higher provisioning requirement or setting aside of their profits under the RBI norms. This was leading to poor credit creation and slowdown in the Indian economy. So because of the creation of the bad bank, which is an asset reconstruction company, the banks will sell their non-performing assets to these asset reconstruction companies. And such asset reconstruction companies buy these non-performing assets in the form of cash as well as security receipts. So in the present case, 15% of the money is paid in the form of cash, while 85% is paid in the form of security receipts. And the Sarfazi Act provides for the issuance of these security receipts. Then once the non-performing assets are acquired by these asset reconstruction companies or the bad bank in this particular case, they recover these non-performing assets through debt restructuring or through the sale of the assets or the mortgage that was initially provided when the banks had provided the loans. And lastly, the payment for the security receipts will be provided by the ARCs or the asset reconstruction companies after deducting their management fee. So what this will do is that this will decrease the non-performing assets on the bank's balance sheet. It will further lead to lowering of the provisioning norms or the requirement of setting aside some part of the profit in terms of the provisioning norms under the RBI's requirement or the guidelines. This will lead to capital getting unlocked on the part of banks because now they will be free from the NPAs as well as provisioning requirement. And what this will do is that this will further lead to increase in credit creation and ultimately would lead to economic growth. So simply summarizing, the banks will sell their non-performing assets to the ARC, which will buy it in the form of 15% cash and 85% security receipts. Then this ARC or the asset reconstruction company will recover the non-performing assets through the debt restructuring or the sale of the assets, and finally will make the payment for the security receipts after deducting their management fee. And this will lead to decrease in the NPAs on the bank's balance sheet, will also lower their provisioning requirement, will lead to increased credit creation in the economy, and ultimately will lead to higher economic growth. But then what is the role of the government here? So the government in this particular case, as it is not the owner of the bad bank and has just facilitated the creation of the bad bank which is owned by the banks which have non-performing assets, the government has decided to give guarantee worth rupees 30,000 crore on the payment of security receipts by the NARCL, because the security receipts are not themselves money, but it will only be provided by the NARCL or the asset reconstruction company only when it recovers the debt from the non-performing assets by the way of debt restructuring or the sale of mortgage. However, if the NARCL is not able to sell the bad loan or if it is sold at a loss, then the government guarantee will be invoked, and the difference between what the bank was supposed to get and what the NARCL was able to raise will be paid from this rupees 30,000 crore that has been provided by the government. So for example, in this case, as we already know that 85% of the NPA will be bought in the form of security receipts. However, if the ARC is not able to restructure the debt or is not able to recover the money, and also if the NARCL had promised a certain amount in the form of security receipts and it was not able to provide it to the bank that particular amount, in that case, this particular difference will be provided by the 30,000 crore fund that has been created by the government. So the difference between what the bank was supposed to get and what the NARCL was able to raise will be paid from the rupees 30,000 crore that has been provided by the government here. This brings us to last and the most important aspect, that is, what are the pros and the cons of the creation of a bad bank in an economy. Let us look at this aspect. Now, the first argument that is provided in the favor of the bad bank, as we have seen, is that it leads to improvement in the balance sheet of banks due to decrease in the non-performing assets. But the argument against the creation of the bad bank is that the bad banks will always stand ready to buy the non-performing assets from the banks. And this would discourage the banks from exercising due caution while lending the loans. And this is termed as a moral hazard, because presently the banks are under the pressure of recovering the non-performing assets. However, when the bad banks will buy such non-performing assets readily, the banks will not even put an effort and will not exercise caution while lending. Second argument in favor of the bad bank is that it will unlock capital that was earlier locked up as provisioning requirement, and this would lead to increase in the credit creation. However, according to the ex-RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan, the setting up of bad bank would merely lead to transfer of assets from one entity to another, and this will not solve the problem of non-performing assets in the Indian banking system. Third argument in favor of the bad banks is that it will enable the banks to focus on their core areas of accepting deposits and lending loans, and the function of recovery of the bad loans gets transferred to the specialized bad bank that has been created. However, the argument against this particular argument is that the non-performing assets of the banks have increased on the account of number of reasons, and these include political interference in the working of the banks, increase in willful defaulters, poor recovery process, etc. And as such, the bad banks do not solve the core underlying reasons which led to the increase in the NPA in the first instance. and the bad bank is thus considered to be a superficial solution to the underlying problem of the non-performing assets. So the argument here is that the underlying problems that are faced by the banking system in the form of political interference, willful defaulters, and the poor recovery process should be dealt with first rather than creation of a bad bank. And the last argument in favor of the bad banks is that most of the non-performing assets are concentrated in large borrowers or the big borrowers who have taken loans from multiple banks. And presently, such banks come together to form the committee of creditors and formulate a resolution plan to recover the NPAs. However, such a mechanism is presently facing the problem of coordination and delays in the recovery of the NPAs. So, the setting up of bad bank in such a scenario would enable the multiple banks to transfer their NPAs simultaneously to bad banks and also improve their balance sheet. So, because of the lack of coordination in the banks that were part of the committee of creditors that had lent their money to the big borrowers, this bad bank has been proposed. However, even after the creation of the bad bank, there will be a perpetual dilemma in terms of what should be the pricing of the non-performing assets. If higher pricing is provided for the non-performing assets, it will be a loss to the asset reconstruction company or the NARCL which has been created. And if the NPAs are priced at a lower rate, it will be a loss to the banks. Further, there will be delays in the recovery of non-performing assets by the ARCs, and that will be a cause of concern. So then what is the way forward from all the pros and the cons or the arguments in favor and against that we have seen related to the bad bank? So the economic survey of 2016 and 17 had emphasized that addressing the stressed asset problem would require 4 R's. First, reform, recognition, recapitalization, and resolution. The setting up of bad bank without focusing on these 4 R's of reform, recognition, recapitalization, and resolution would mean that the fundamental problems that have led to the non-performing assets in the first place will continue to remain. And hence, the setting up of the ARC-AMC model in the form of a bad bank to resolve the stressed assets should be accompanied with the required reforms that were proposed by the economic survey in the form of 4 R's. So this was all about the bad bank. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This article on page number 6 is regarding the ranking that is published by the Ministry of Education that is known as the NIRF framework. And under this NIRF framework, the higher education institutions are ranked. However, the author in this article highlights certain issues in India's higher education system. And we have already discussed the various aspects of the problems that are faced by the higher education in India and how to handle them and what are the initiatives of the Government of India in this regard in the DNS of 10 September 2021. So in this regard, let us revise from the DNS of 10 September 2021 different aspects and the challenges faced by higher education system in India, and also what are the various initiatives that have been taken by the Government of India in this regard. And this topic is also extremely important for us from the mains examination perspective. Now this article on page number 1 is related to the NIRF ranking, and the IITs have secured the top ranks in these rankings for 2021. In this regard, let us try and understand what are the parameters on which the rankings are decided. Also, we'll understand what are the issues that India faces in terms of higher education and what are some of the initiatives that have been taken by the Government of India. So the points that we discuss here can be easily used in writing answers in the mains examination, in the general studies paper 2, in the topic related to education. So this discussion will mainly be about the higher education issue. So according to these NIRF rankings which are released by Ministry of Education, the top 8 places have been taken by various IITs, which are followed by JNU on place 9th and the Banaras Hindu University on place 10th. So about these NIRF rankings, these were first launched by Ministry of Education in 2015. What are the parameters for deciding such ranks? Let us look at these parameters now. So the parameters that are included for decision on the NIRF rankings include the teaching and learning and resources. This includes student strength, including doctoral students, faculty-student ratio, etc. And the weightage to this particular parameter is about 30%. The next 30% weightage has been provided to research and professional practice. In this, it includes the number of research papers that were published by particular institutions, the intellectual property rights licensed, and the projects that were conducted. Besides this, 20% weightage is provided to graduation outcomes, that is, number of placements, median salary of the placed students. 10% to outreach and inclusivity, that is percentage of students from other states or countries, from various socio-economic background, women students, etc. And 10% is about the perception, that is what is the peer perception and what is the public perception of these institutions. So these are the parameters on which the NIRF ranking is decided. And accordingly, in this, the top 8 positions have been secured by various IITs, while the 9th and the 10th position have been secured by JNU and BHU respectively. This brings us to one important issue, that is, what are the issues that India's higher education system faces? Let us look at these issues one by one, which are especially important for us from the mains examination perspective. But before that, let us first look at what is the current status of higher education in India. So according to a survey, that is All India Survey on Higher Education Report 2019 and 20, the gross enrollment ratio in higher education has increased from around 10% in 2004-2005 to about 27% in 2019 and 20. So this is a positive sign. Secondly, the college density, that is the number of colleges per lakh eligible population, is about 30. Regarding gender parity index in higher education, it is about 1.01 against 1 that was there in 2018 and 19. And this indicates an improvement in the relative access to higher education for females of eligible age group compared to males. Then what is the ratio of pupil-teacher ratio? That is, what is the student-teacher ratio? So it is about 26. Now, as far as the challenges or the issues in the higher education are concerned, first is that although the gross enrollment ratio, as we have seen, that is highlighted by the report, has increased over the period, but still India lags in the world average of 33%. So the world average of gross enrollment ratio in higher education is about 33%, while it is 27% only in case of India. When compared with other countries, the Brazil has around 46%, while China has around 30% gross enrollment ratio in higher education. Besides the gross enrollment ratio, regional and social disparities continue to exist in the higher education gross enrollment ratio. And it varies from about 5.5% only in Daman and Diu to about 56.1% in Chandigarh. So this clearly highlights the regional disparity that exists in terms of gross enrollment in higher education. Further, students belonging to vulnerable communities like the ST community constitute only about 5.6%. So this data can be very important in justifying some of the issues in higher education. Then the question comes up regarding the quality. So quality is also a challenge in higher education in India, and only 3 Indian institutions feature in the top 200 in the world rankings. Next issue is regarding the employability of the graduates. And according to India's Skills Report 2021, less than half of our graduates are employable. That is, only 45.9% of the graduates in India are employable. Then there is issue of infrastructure. We have poor infrastructure like libraries or laboratories, and this is also one of the biggest challenge. Further, research and innovation also lags behind, and there is inadequate focus on research in higher education institutions. Reasons are many, including scarcity of funds, ill-equipped laboratories, weak linkage of research, higher education, and the industry. Then another important issue in higher education system in India is that there are islands of excellence. We note that India has developed islands of excellence such as IITs or the Indian Institute of Science and Research. And government allocates a major chunk of its budget to these few premier institutes, while most of the regional and the state universities are very poorly funded. So this is again another issue related to higher education funding in India. Now, as far as the governance challenge in terms of higher education in India is concerned, there is issue of over-centralization, lack of autonomy, and transparency. Now, higher education institutions in India are affiliated by UGC and AICTE. Often these affiliations do not give enough autonomy to design their own curriculum. The UGC document on guidelines for autonomous colleges highlights that only safe and better way to improve the quality of undergraduate education is to delink most of the colleges from the affiliating structure and granting autonomy status to deserved institutions. So all the reports as well as UGC itself has highlighted that there is issue of over-centralization, and as such, the institutions which deserve autonomy should be provided with autonomy so that they can design their courses. So after looking at some of the challenges faced by the higher education system in India, let us look at what are the various government initiatives related to the improvement in higher education. First and foremost, we note that the Government of India has come out with the NIRF ranking, and these aim at increasing the competitiveness of higher education institutions in India. Second is the Institute of Eminence status that has been provided by the Government of India. So the government intends to establish 20 institutes of eminence to achieve world-class status from amongst the existing government or private institutions and also new institutions from the private sector. Also, Government of India also aims at providing the autonomy, and the institutes of eminence tag will give greater autonomy, freedom to decide fees, course durations, and the governance structures. Also, the public institutions under the IOE tag will receive a government grant of rupees 1000 crore, while the private institutions will not get any funding under the scheme. The government has also created a Higher Education Financing Agency, that is HEFA. It is a joint venture of Ministry of Education and the Canara Bank for financing creation of capital assets in premier education institutions of India. The objective is to revitalize the infrastructure and the systems in the higher education and also bringing new investments in research and related infrastructure. The government has also initiated Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. This is a centrally sponsored scheme launched at providing strategic funding to the eligible state higher education institutions. In this, the central government will provide funding in the ratio of 60 to 40 for general category states. For special category states, this will be about 90 to 10, that is 90% funding will be provided by the central government while 10% by the state governments. And for union territories, the central government will provide around 100% of the funding. So these are some of the issues and initiatives of the Government of India for improving the higher education in India. With this, let's take up the next news article now. Now, besides the articles that we have discussed today, there are other articles that are also important. First one is on page number 7, and this is regarding one of the contentious social issues, that is criminalization of marital rape in India, which has not been criminalized till date. Accordingly, this issue has been discussed in detail in the DNS of 31st August 2021 by Pallavi ma'am, and the various aspects, issues and debates regarding the marital rape and its criminalization have been discussed in quite detail in this DNS video. Go through this DNS to understand the various aspects, which can be a very important topic for us from General Studies Paper 2 in the social issues section. With this, we conclude today's discussion, and this is the question for the day.